Despite being connected to one of the most recognizable scary movies of all time, starring A-list acting talent, or seeming like the sort of buzzy project that would earn a nice profit, each of the following 8 movies all ultimately flopped at the box office this year. Now that's not to say they're all terrible films. Some were actually well reviewed and up there as some of the strongest entries of 2024. But regardless of whether they were brilliantly horrifying or just a bit of a mess, each of these movies share one thing in common: no one really wanted to watch them on the big screen. So I'm Gareth, this is What Culture Horror, and here are 8 horror movies that flopped hard in 2024. Number 8, The Watchers. Following in the footsteps of her famous father, Ashana Night Shyamalan hopped into the director's chair for the first time for this year's supernatural horror The Watchers, telling the tale of an artist called Mina who ends up trapped in a forest that contains some mysterious creatures. Based on A.M. Shine's 2021 novel, the premise definitely felt creepy enough to bring in a few of its own watchers this summer. But despite going out of their way to promote the fact that M. Night Shyamalan was very much attached to the project as producer, and this was a film from the mind of his own offspring, folks were scared off from seeing it. This was possibly down to its poor critical reception, with the movie's script being criticized and Ashana's work being labeled as a pale imitation of her father's patented style. Yikes. Now, the movie did fare a little better on Max at least, even becoming the most popular movie on the streaming service at one point, but that still doesn't change the fact it only made a little over its $30 million budget by the end of its disappointing theatrical run. Which horror movie do you think people need to see from 2024, folks? You let me know in the comment section right down below. Number 7, Afraid. Blumhouse has certainly enjoyed a ton of success at the box office over the years. The likes of The Sinister, Insidious, Paranormal Activity, and The Purge films are just a few of the projects that have helped turn the production company into one of the most prominent in the business. However, even Blumhouse experiences a flop every now and then, and Afraid was certainly that in 2024. Directed and written by the person who helmed The Golden Compass and the Twilight Saga New Moon, Chris Weitz, the movie focuses on a family who end up trying out a new smart home AI that inevitably becomes quite dangerous as it learns about and ultimately manipulates them. The usual stuff then. Similarly to The Watchers though, the John Cho and Catherine Waterston starring psychological horror was perhaps impacted by a wave of bad reviews just before its release, generally being described as a quite formulaic and uninspiring entry into the techno-horror subgenre. It likely didn't help that it was facing stiff horror competition from Alien Romulus at the time of its release either, and the film could have suffered from bad word of mouth too. I mean, it only scored a 51% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, so, take that as you will. Whatever the reason, the movie brought in a hugely underwhelming $12.6 million on a $12 million budget in the end, with many clearly being afraid of wasting their money on this particular Blumhouse dud. Number 6, The First Omen. For a movie to be deemed a success for a studio, or at the very least profitable, it typically needs to earn about 2 to 2.5 times its budget at the box office, with this then covering the cost of marketing the picture and the fact that theaters take a cut from the film's earnings too. And that's why the first 2 entries on this list can sadly only be classed as flops in 2024, and the same applies to this year's prequel to the iconic horror known as The Omen too. This 6th installment in the franchise about American nun Margaret Dano's discovery of a conspiracy looking to bring about the birth of the Antichrist may have scored some unexpectedly strong reviews, but that still wasn't enough to get butts in seats. Perhaps it was the fact many weren't all that desperate to see another entry in a series that hadn't produced a good film in decades. Or maybe its similarities to Immaculate left those who'd watched that earlier release not seeing the point of sitting down to watch the same sort of movie again. Either way, Arkasha Stevenson's film underperformed. Now, it may be a bit harsh to call it an absolute box office disaster. I mean, it still earned a not awful $53.9 million worldwide, but against a $30 million budget, steep for an R-rated horror, that number certainly wasn't what 20th Century Studios were hoping for. Though The First Omen would ultimately go on to experience more success on the streaming stage it was initially designed for, it still has to go down as a horror failure at the box office in 2024. Number 5, Never Let Go. Lionsgate has had a rough old 2024 so far, along with misfires like Borderlands, The Crow reboot, 1992, and The Killer's Game all failing to turn a profit. The Halle Berry starring survival horror Never Let Go has become one of the latest flops from the studio too. Released towards the end of September, this latest picture from French horror filmmaker Alexandre Aja boasted a compelling and dedicated leading performance from Berry that attracted a lot of praise from critics and viewers alike. Away from Berry's stellar work though, the story of a mother trying to protect her kids from evil spirits itself didn't really generate much buzz. Though it did actually come with a few terrifying visuals, the film that sees one of Mama's kids begin to doubt whether the evil exists was labelled as derivative and repetitive, only scoring in the 50s for both its tomato meter and popcorn meter percentages. It is evident that both reviewers and moviegoers were very much happy to let this one go. Many didn't even bother trying it out in the first place if its poor box office total was anything to go by. With just $21.8 million made from a $20 million budget, tentative plans for a prequel and sequel are likely to be let go of too. Thank you very much for checking out this What Culture Horror list today, my friend. If you're enjoying yourself, well, hit that subscribe button down below and you're gonna get more of these What Culture Horror videos just entering your life, and that just sounds like my kind of life right there. Number 4, I Saw the TV Glow. Another studio that has experienced its fair share of horror triumphs, A24 has released many a frightening picture in recent years, with Talk to Me being one of last year's biggest scary hits, for example. The studio has not been able to replicate that level of box office success with a number of their 2024 releases though, despite being a picture that had generated a lot of excitement heading into its US and international debut, and one that also earned a ton of praise from critics after its Sundance premiere. Not a lot of people ended up wandering into theaters to see Jane Schoenbrun's I Saw the TV Glow. The film sees two troubled souls bond over a TV show, The Pink Opaque, that makes them question their own reality. But that intriguing premise, the movie's stunning cinematography, and captivating central performances from Justice Smith and Bridget Lundy-Payne still were not enough to lure viewers into cinemas. This psychological horror that delves into themes of identity and obsession was set to have been made with a $10 million budget, with its eventual $5 million box office total making it one of the studio's biggest flops of 2024. But it is a story that will likely continue to mesmerize audiences on streaming in the coming years, so there's always a silver lining, or glow, or whatever. Number 3, The Front Room. On the subject of A24 2024 horror flops, Max and Sam Egger's The Front Room is starting to look like yet another to add to that list. Starring Brandy as a pregnant woman who is forced to deal with her creepy, racist mother-in-law when she moves into her home, the horror comedy is being described as one of the most grotesque of the year, but it's one that many clearly just did not fancy putting themselves through. Either due to not exactly great word of mouth, it's currently sitting at 41% on the popcorn meter, or the fact critics have been quick to crap on the bodily fluid stuffed picture, viewers have largely decided to steer clear of this particular Front Room. And that is definitely shown in the movie's poor box office performance at time of recording, with it only bringing home a measly $3.7 million so far. For a film that was probably made for somewhere in the $5 million range, that is a terrible number whatever way you slice it. Opening against Beetlejuice was always going to make life a bit hard for the Egger brothers' first feature, but they were still likely hoping for better than this. Instead, The Front Room has ultimately become a disaster that both the studio and director will want to forget about in a hurry. Number 2, The Exorcism. In the wake of the surprising success story that was last year's The Pope's Exorcist, yet another Russell Crowe starring exorcism film landed in theaters in 2024. Only this one wasn't quite as much of a hit. Or a hit at all, really. Instead, Miramax and Vertical's The Exorcism was just dumped in theaters back in June without much fanfare, after originally wrapping principal photography in 2019. This led to the film, which had an estimated budget of around $21 million, only being able to bring in a grand total of $9 million by the end of its run. This time, Crowe is playing an actor called Anthony Miller, who ends up playing a priest in a horror movie, with said troubled star eventually becoming somewhat disruptive, resulting in his daughter trying to figure out if he's falling back into old addictions or something darker is going on. Not sold? Well, neither were most people, clearly. Shudder acquired the streaming rights for the project, condemned as unnecessary and a bit of a mess that will no doubt one day be seen when you're struggling to find something to watch on a slow Friday night. And that is probably the place a lot of people will end up seeing the poorly received picture now, with most understandably not feeling this inferior Exorcism that picked up just a 28% tomato meter score was worth the increasingly expensive price of a cinema ticket to see. And number 1, Lisa Frankenstein. Bringing this list to an end is easily one of the biggest box office catastrophes of 2024 so far. Look, on paper, pairing rising star Catherine Newton with Riverdale's Cole Sprouse for a horror comedy romance story written by Jennifer's Body's Diablo Cody, and also directed by Zelda Williams, daughter of the iconic Robin Williams, seemed like a quite interesting combination. But folks evidently just weren't that bothered about seeing Lisa fall in love with a Victorian dead man who was reanimated by a bolt of lightning on the big screen, with Lisa Frankenstein, a movie with a $13 million budget, only managing to earn a grand total of $9.9 million worldwide. The way the movie blends genres clearly wasn't to everyone's tastes, and it was even described as a horror-com smoothie made mostly of ancient moldy fruit. Ouch. Those mixed to bad reviews and being dropped in the movie graveyard that is February both likely contributed to Lisa Frankenstein's terrible numbers. But judging from its current popcorn meter score of 81%, Lisa Frankenstein certainly still has its fans out there and could find a new life as a cult favorite in the future. Fingers crossed, eh?